Hello, hello. If you can hear me on Zoom or?
Yeah, turn my volume off. So
okay, all right. Okay, let's get started. Can people on Zoom hear me? Any sign of life on Zoom? Yes, good. Okay, thank you. Excellent. All right, so welcome back, everyone. Today I'll be talking about visual search. We have next week Andre Barbu from MIT, who will be talking about language, and then our own Susan Murphy from the Department of Computer Science will be giving a lecture at the, about AI and health and big data. Those are these are the three final lectures for the class. Then after that, on April 18th, we'll have an Ask Me Anything / debate session. Last year it was a lot of fun, so this is again for you. So please come prepare with questions. Last year we had questions about ethics in AI. We had questions about artificial general intelligence, about singularity, about neuroscience and AI, all kinds of questions. So it's mostly going to be for fun and discussion. Hopefully I'll try to bring some other lectures in addition to myself as well for to have some sort of difference of opinions and debate. As a default, I will be the person in that session. Then we'll have the presentations from all of you for the final project, and then the final projects are due on May 5th. Okay, so I'd like to get started with talking about visual search, and I chose this problem to discuss today because I think it illustrates a lot of potential aspects of the dialogue between neuroscience and artificial intelligence. So I'll talk about what happens when we search for things. So this could be searching for your car keys, searching for a particular icon on your phone or your computer, searching for a friend in a crowd, etc. And I'll talk about a little bit about what happens inside the brain when people are doing visual search. I'll talk about some behavioral experiments, and specifically, I will also discuss a family of computational models that I think can provide a first-order approximation to different aspects of visual search. Again, as I said many times, this is for you. So please stop me and ask questions as much as needed throughout. I have a lot of slides, but I'm happy to take this in any direction based on your questions. Because of Zoom, I'm going to be staying here. I won't walk around. So for people who are very far, if you want to come closer, you're welcome to. And I want to start with trying to switch to the next slide. Okay. So if you have a laser pointer, you cannot switch. Like this is very annoying. Well, that's one way to do it. Oh, space will do it. Oh, good. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Many of you have seen this picture before. I like this picture because I think it illustrates a lot of the complexity in visual scene understanding. Some of you may have heard me talk about this picture before, so I'm going to be very brief. The point I want to make is that given an image, there's much more to visual scene understanding than labeling objects in that image. We, the field, have become quite proficient at segmenting objects, at labeling different objects in an image. And yet being able to capture everything that's going on here remains quite daunting. So I'm going to give you only a brief glimpse of some of the approaches that one could take towards solving the problem of scene understanding. I won't really get to building models that can capture what's happening here. Again, I will focus about on the problem of visual search. But you can imagine that to understand what's happening here, you need to understand different segments of the image. So you need to understand that people are smiling. You need to look at Obama's foot. You need to look at the scale. There are different aspects that need to be integrated together. And so one of the themes that I want to talk about today is the problem of visual search and eye movements. So when people stare at an image, what you're seeing here, this yellow dot comes from an actual measurement of eye movements when a subject is staring at this picture. This is 12 seconds of somebody staring at this picture. This is actually looping, so when it gets to 12, it starts all over. You see that people, when they look at an image like this one, they're constantly moving their eyes. And if you've never thought about this, this may come as a surprise to you because it doesn't quite look like we're moving our eyes all the time. If I ask you and you never thought about it, you may think that your eyes are more or less fixed in space, but that's very far from the case. Depending on exactly what you're doing, we move our eyes 2, 3, 4 times a second in this very rapid, almost ballistic movements that are called saccades. They span several degrees of visual angle. So again, the 1 degree of visual angle is approximately the size of your thumb if you extend your arm. So you make many degrees of visual angle every time, and you move rapidly from one place to another, scanning the image. And you can try to look at somebody and look at their eyes, and you'll see that they're constantly moving their eyes all the time when they're looking at an image. And this is quite perplexing because of for several reasons. One, as I said, if you haven't thought about it, you may not know that you're moving your eyes all the time. Another reason that this is quite perplexing is that it turns out that if you were not able to move your eyes at all, the visual scene basically would completely disappear. So this is a very, very strange phenomenon that was discovered about 100 years ago. If you can stabilize the image perfectly so that you cannot move your eyes at all, neurons in the brain basically adapt. And that means that they start firing less and less. And eventually you're basically blind. You don't see anything at all. So you move your eyes, you see what's there. But if you don't move your eyes again, the visual scene basically disappears. So we need eye movements to be able to see anything at all. One of the reasons why we need to move our eyes is because the resolution of our image changes drastically between the fixation point, that is where our eyes are fixating, and everything else on the screen. And I'll try to do a quick demo of that. What I'd like you to do is to fixate on the D here from the word dream. By fixate, what I mean is you should look at that and not move your eyes. If you're moving your eyes, you're cheating, okay? So without moving your eyes, I'd like you to try to read something that's outside and far from that D. For example, try to go a few sentences above, a few sentences below, and try to read far from that letter D. And I hope that it's pretty clear to you that it's basically impossible to read outside of what you are fixating. So when you're actually reading, what you're doing is moving your eyes almost from one word to another, sometimes skipping one word, but you're constantly moving your eyes in order to be able to read. And that is because you have very, very high resolution at the fixation point and very, very poor resolution outside of the fixation point. As a matter of fact, in the far periphery, that is very far from the fixation point, is so poor that we are legally blind. If you compare what a legally blind person sees, that's basically what we see in the far periphery. This is also perplexing because we have the illusion that everything in our visual field has very high resolution. Whenever I'm moving your eyes, everything seems to be very nitty and very clear, and I don't have this idea that I can only see basically what's in the fixation point. And in fact, if you have something and you don't move it, that's outside. So for example, I'm fixating here and I'm trying to look at my hand. It's very, very hard to even see it unless you start moving it. We are very good at detecting motion in the periphery, but visual recognition in the periphery is actually very bad. So a lot of what's happened in computer vision in AI has dealt with relatively small images. If you want to process a large image, like my entire visual field here, at very high resolution as you have in the fovea, you would need to have neural networks that are enormous, and the computational cost of training them would be enormous as well. So one of the ways in which our visual system evolved is to have very high resolution in the fovea and then very sophisticated machinery to either move our head or to move our eyes in order to bring the center of the attention and the center of fixation to the parts that we want to pay more attention to. So this is basically what we're doing when we're doing visual search, and today I'll talk about visual search. So this is a classical example. Most of you are probably very familiar with this kind of children's books and games of finding Waldo. I found a few years ago that people have different names for Waldo in different countries and different cultures. So apparently this character goes by Waldo, by Wally, by Charlie, by Walter, etc., etc. So searching for an object in a crowded scene is actually a pretty complicated task. And if you're actually trying to move your eyes now and find Waldo, it's actually pretty challenging. If you found him, kudos to you. I always like to point out where he is because everybody wants to know. So he's right there. But this is a pretty challenging task. It's very hard. And it's hard because in order to do visual search, we need to combine what I think are the 4 key principles of visual search. The first one is selectivity. We want to be able to discriminate the target, in this case, Waldo, from any possible distractors in the image. The second one is invariance. We want to be able to find the target irrespective of changes in its appearance. For example, if you're looking for a friend in a crowd, you may not know what he or she is wearing. You may not know whether he or she had a haircut, whether they're wearing makeup, whether they shave their beard or not. The illumination may be different. There may be lots and lots of changes in the image, and you want to be able to recognize that person and find that person irrespective of all these changes. And I refer to that as invariance, the fact that you're not doing template matching, but you're actually looking for some object in some high-level feature space that's not just matching identical pixels. We want to do this, all of this in an efficient manner. That is, I don't want to have a template for Waldo and have to scan the image pixel by pixel through the entire image. We want to be able to move our eyes a couple of times until we find the image. So efficiency is a critical aspect of visual search. And finally, I would contend that we want to do visual search and be able to generalize. That is, we want to be able to do visual search in a zero-shot fashion. I want to be able to give you an image of an object, a target object that you have never seen before. For example, let's say that you don't speak Chinese or Hebrew or Arabic. I can give you a character that you've never seen before, and you can still find it on a page, even if you don't know what that means. So we want to be able to look at an object once and be able to search for that object. So this is very different from what people do in computer vision when they build algorithms for object detection, where basically you have a certain number of categories that you can actually detect, and you have to train that system with millions and millions of examples. Here I want to be able to show you a single example and should be able to search for that. So for example, I don't know how many people know what this is. If you have never seen this before, I would contend that you can still search for this object in an image. So for example, I can give you an image like this one, and you can probably figure out where that object is. Despite the fact that perhaps some of you have never seen that particular contraption before, unless you do rock climbing or ice climbing, you may have never seen this kind of contraption, and yet you can probably find it here. And note also that the object here doesn't look identical to the one that I just showed you. You can probably find that object in here as well. And you can even probably find it here, where I think it looks quite different from the way it looks in the original picture. So I think this illustrates the fact that even if you've never seen this particular object before, you can search for it in a zero-shot fashion. You can search for it in an invariant fashion, and you can select it and discriminate it from the distractors. And I would contend, and I will show, that you can do this in an efficient way, that is without having to scan every single pixel in the image. So in general, I will talk about a family of visual search tasks where you have a target image, like Waldo, and a search image. And the goal is to find the target image within the search image in an invariant manner without doing pixel template matching, because the target object could be different. And we want to do this efficiently, invariantly, and in a zero-shot fashion. So is the goal clear? Any questions so far? Okay. So I'll talk about work from several people. First, I'll give you a flavor for a type of model that I will argue can achieve these key properties of visual search. I will talk a little about the trade-off between exploration and exploitation. I will also use this as an example to illustrate how the visual diets on how you train a system can be important in the final outcome. And then if time permits, I will talk about contextual reasoning in visual search as well. So I will talk about several different tasks, and they all have a similar structure. Yes? I think that's a great question. So I think let's discuss what we mean by the word object. I think it's pretty clear that if you just look at the number of possible images, the number of possible images is astronomical. If you just take, let's say, as a target image, let's say that we construct images that are 256 by 256 pixels. Each pixel can have three colors. The number of possible objects in that sense is astronomical. So I can guarantee that you have not seen most of those things. Okay, so now we say, well, okay, but those are not real objects, right? Objects have some properties like continuity, there's some contours, some shapes. They have some properties that are so that's not a good. So then I think I find it a little bit hard to quantify exactly what it means to see it. I think it's clear that I can show you contraption objects that you have not seen before, and psychologists have entertained themselves actually building shapes that follow this smoothness and continuity and so on that are unique by definition, by construction. Now you can argue, well, but I've seen similar things before, or kind of similar things. So even if you have never seen this particular object, maybe you've seen something that looks like it. And then I think it becomes a little bit hard to quantify exactly what our training diet is. So I think it's a good point, and I think that makes it often hard to compare humans or other animals and computer vision, because it's hard to know exactly what my visual diet has been. So I think it's an important point. I think in some sense there are many objects that we haven't quite seen. How similar those are to other objects, I think it's a difficult question. And I think it is true that if I create objects that have completely different statistics, then it would be very hard for you and for me to actually recognize those objects. One example of that is barcodes in the supermarket. Good luck trying to read those barcodes yourself, right? So these are, you can say these are objects, and it's really hard to search for those objects, right? Another example is the famous MNIST dataset. There's something called the permuted MNIST dataset, where you basically permute the pixels. You permute them in a fixed fashion so that the zeros still cluster, the ones still cluster, but they don't really look like anything you've ever seen before. So if you really disrupt completely the statistics of objects, it is true that we struggle, and I think that that's a fair comment. Great question. Any other comments, questions? Okay, so I'll show you several tasks that look more or less like this. There's a target object. In this case, the target is to look for cats in the image. And then there will be an image here. This is the search image, and people will have to move their eyes to find that particular target. In this particular rendering, this is way too small for you to be able to see anything. But remember that in the actual experiment, these are actually quite large. So this is about 5 degrees of visual angle. So each of these objects is more or less the size of your hand if you extend your hand. So they're pretty large and relatively easy to search. So this is what happens when people are actually doing these tasks. Oh, maybe not. No. Okay, I'll try one more time. Okay. This is not what happens when you're doing this task. What you're supposed to see is that yellow dot moving. So trust me, believe me, I'm a scientist. When you do this task, you actually move your eyes, going from one object, fixating on one object, then fixating on another object until you actually find the target. All right, I don't know how to show this video. All right, so I want to show you how people perform when they do this type of task. So what you're seeing here on the x-axis is the fixation number, so that people fixate on one object and a second object, third object, etc. And then on the y-axis is the cumulative performance. So if you were to move your eyes randomly from one object to another, without ever returning to a previously visited location, and I will come back to that soon, the performance that you would get is chance, and it's dictated by this line here. So the probability that you'll get it right the first time would be 1/6, the probability that you get it right the second time would be 2/6, and at the end, the probability is 1 because there were 6 objects on the search image in this particular case. Humans perform better than chance. They don't perform perfectly, indicating that this is not a trivial task. They usually get it right on the first fixation only about 30% of the time. They get it right on the sixth fixation a little bit less than 100% of the time. And the reason for this difference, the reason why they're not perfect at 6 fixations, because humans are quite stubborn creatures. And sometimes they do go back, even though the target was not at the right location, they sometimes do go back. And I will discuss that again. And this is the overall performance. This is the cumulative performance of humans when they are searching for an object in this array of 6 images. Mind you, this object this is not template matching. The object can be rotated. It can be a different exemplar from the same class. For example, you're looking for a chair, and the target chair is different from the chair in the search images, and so on. So our goal is to build a computational model that will mimic performance in this flavor of tasks. Before I do that, I'd like to give you a quick glimpse of what happens inside the brain by looking at neurophysiological recordings in monkeys performed in the lab of Bob Desimon at MIT. This is a task that monkeys were doing, which is very similar to the one I just showed you for humans. So monkeys are instructed to find a particular target object, in this case, this shoe here, and then they will move their eyes. They start fixating in the middle, and then they will move their eyes until they actually find that target. In this particular case, there were 2 types of trials. There were some trials that are called detection trials, when there's only a single object on the screen, and the subjects have to just go from the fixation directly to that object. And then the actual search trials, when there's a search image and the monkey has to move their eyes until they find the object. So now I'll show you a glimpse of neuronal recordings in 2 particular areas of the macaque monkey brain that are crucial for object recognition, and I will contend also crucial for visual search. So the first is an area called IT, inferior temporal cortex. We know that IT is necessary for visual object recognition. Lesions in area IT basically lead to severe deficits in object recognition, both in monkeys as well as in humans. So what you're seeing here is on the y-axis the average activity of many neurons in inferior temporal cortex after normalizing as a function of time, where time 0 is the time when the cue was presented. Okay, so here there's a single object on the screen. This cue is presented, and there are 2 curves because the investigators divided the images into 2 kinds of images. To make it very simple, there are preferred images. That is, there are images that trigger high activation in this in the neuron, and there are non-preferred images. That is, images that the neurons didn't care for. Different neurons have different types of selectivity. So one neuron may be interested in chairs, another neuron may be interested in tables, another one in faces, etc. So they have different kinds of selectivity. Here we're averaging all the responses to the good images, that's in red, and all the bad images, that's in blue. So this is just showing that there are neurons in inferior temporal cortex that are selective to a presentation of that visual cue. The second figure here shows recordings in the prefrontal cortex. This is an area that's 1 or 2 synapses away from inferior temporal cortex. And this is an area that also shows this type of visual selectivity upon presenting the cue. And why I'm showing these two brain areas will become apparent soon. So I showed you the responses during visual search. Now I'm showing you what happens during detection. So detection, again, remember, is when the monkeys are making a saccade to a single object on the screen. So the curves look pretty similar at first glance. Again, you have visual selectivity. The neurons are still responding selectively to their preferred objects. So I want to point a couple of differences. The most notable one is that in prefrontal cortex, before the animal actually makes a saccade to the target, there's already some kind of selective activity. So it's as if prefrontal cortex is holding information about the object, the target object, such that that information is present even before the monkey has to actually make the saccade during this detection task. So in some sense, there's kind of a memory of what the animal needs to search for. And finally, I want to show you responses during the visual search task itself. And here the responses are aligned to the time when they will start to move their eyes towards the target. So they're about to find the target and they're going to move their eyes towards the target. And again, what you see is that after the eyes land on the target, there's a differential response between the two types of images. There's still a response that's stronger for the preferred versus non-preferred image. But again, what I'd like to point out is that in prefrontal cortex, but not in inferior temporal cortex, there is some kind of memory of the particular target that the animal is looking for. So the investigators went further. I'm going to skip this. So the investigators went further and they used inactivate. Yes. I'm sorry, say it again. Yes, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying anything different. So somehow you show the cue, and somewhere in the brain, you need to have information about what you're looking for, right? So the cue disappears, and then either you have detection tasks or you have a visual search task, but you need to have some of this information readily available. So you call it residual information. You can call it residual information. I call it memory. That is, this is partly what happens during the delay to be able to search for the image. Okay. So in other words, the activity in prefrontal cortex starts being selective earlier than in inferior temporal cortex. There's some kind of signal that precedes the visual signal that's relevant for object recognition. Sorry, can you shout or? I'm pretty sure that here they define it independently for so I think they had many. I just showed you one trial here, but they had lots and lots of these trials. Okay, and then based on the cue activity, you can look at the responses in IT. You can look at the response in prefrontal and say what are preferred images, what are non-preferred images in order to show that figure. Does that make sense? Right, but this is an average plot, right? So the red here doesn't need to match the other red, right? So this is an average over all the neurons. So you're right. So in one trial the preference may be different, right? But this is an average across all the neurons in IT and in prefrontal. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, so the last experimental point from neuroscience that I want to show you is that the investigators then went on and inactivated prefrontal cortex. And so what you're seeing here are the results of what happens at the behavior level, that is how well the monkey can find those objects when the prefrontal cortex is inactivated. There are two types of inactivation. One is ipsilateral and the other one is contralateral. So it turns out that most of visual cortex has pretty heavy lateralization, meaning that if you show images on the right visual field, they're largely processed in the left hemisphere and vice versa. You might remember that the lecture from Rick Bourne that described in more detail the anatomy of cortex and how it maps onto the contralateral visual field. So you would expect that the effects of inactivating the right frontal cortex would particularly impact what happens in the contralateral, that is when the visual stimuli are shown on the left part of the visual field and vice versa, and that's what they're showing here. There are two bars here. The one with the stripes corresponds to the regular performance of the sorry, the one on the right, yes. So the one here corresponds to what happens in the performance when the monkey, the regular performance of the monkey without inactivation. And then what you see here, the difference here is the impairment in performance that you see when prefrontal cortex is inactivated. This is actually reversed in the ipsilateral condition and particularly strong in the contralateral condition. So this here is what happens in terms of the percentage of errors. So again, the same idea. There's a pretty significant, in this case, a reduction in performance when there's a much larger number of errors when the prefrontal cortex is inactivated. Sorry, I think I said it the other way around. Let me start again. When the prefrontal cortex is inactivated, that is without prefrontal cortex activity, there's a much larger percentage of errors here compared to this situation, which is with the control with the intact prefrontal cortex. And the same thing happens here in terms of the number of saccades. So in this case, a lower number of saccades means better, a lower number of errors is better. And this is what happens in the detection case. Remember, in the detection case, there's a single object. The monkeys are not doing visual search. So in the case that there is, in the detection task without visual search, there is no such impairment due to prefrontal cortex. In other words, IT can do very well by itself, or the visual cortex in general can do very well by itself in terms of visual recognition, but prefrontal cortex is needed in order to solve this visual search task. So inspired by these ideas from neuroscience and by the behavioral results, I'd like now to introduce a very simple neural network model based on some of the ideas in AI that we have been discussing throughout the class that will try to solve the problem of visual search. So the first step in that model will be to take the target image and pass that target image through a deep convolutional neural network. So this is a typical convolutional neural network that has multiple stages. For many of the pictures that I'm going to show here, we're going to use a particular neural network called VGG16. The details turn out that don't really matter too much, which particular neural network it is. Importantly, this neural network here is pre-trained on ImageNet. That is, it's trained on objects that are different from the ones that are being tested here. We can go back to the previous question and ask how different are they, but they're not trained on the same family of images. They're not trained with the same exact objects. After we extract features from these objects, again, this is an object that the network has never seen before during training. We extract those images, and we're going to store those features in a module here at the very top that we roughly identify as prefrontal cortex. So this is what you call the residual activity. This is our information about what kinds of features we are interested in looking for. So the size of this vector here in prefrontal cortex is basically the same size as the last layer in this network. Next, we're going to be shown a search image And the goal is to search for that target object in that search image. That search image will go through the same deep convolutional neural network. That is, the weights are shared between the two networks, so it's exactly the same network. It's exactly the same brain, the same visual cortex that's processing both images, except that we're processing them in time, right? So first we process one, then the other. And then we're going to have top-down activation from prefrontal cortex onto the last layer of the search images. And we're going to propagate that so that we have a spatial map of how similar different parts of the search image are to the target. So the question is, how similar is this object to the target? How similar is this object to the target, etc., etc. And the way we're going to do that is by comparing this feature vector and multiplying it with the last layer here of the responses to this search image. Is there a question, or are you scratching your head? Okay, all right, good. All right. So once we do this comparison, what we end up with at the end is a degree of similarity of different parts of the image with the target image. So we're going to say that the first eye movement for the model will be the maximum of this map. We refer to this as attention map. This is the map by which the target dictates which parts of the image we're going to pay attention to. The model will make a movement, an eye movement towards that particular target. So either the target is present at that location or the model made a mistake. If the target is present, then the search ends. If the target is not present, then, okay, so this is the winner take all. This is where we move our eyes. This is the location that the model selects as the first eye movement. If the target is not present, we have infinite inhibition of return. That is, we block that location so that the model doesn't go back to that particular location. And then we select the next maximum in the map, and then we go on and on. So the model in this way can make multiple eye movements to subsequent maxima in this attention map. So the model selects one object, then another object, and so on, in order to search for this target image. So there's a bottom-up component, which is processing the search image and the target image. There's a top-down signal and a memory signal that we tentatively ascribe to prefrontal cortex. And I will argue that this can work in a zero-shot fashion. Again, we didn't train the model at any point with these objects. In fact, there's not a single free parameter in this model. We're not tweaking any parameters in here. And I will argue that this is efficient and that this is also invariant, because this object can be different in the search, in the target image and in the search image. For example, we can rotate the object, we can change it, and then we can still search for that. Okay, so now let me show you the results for the model. This is the human data that I showed you before. And this is what the model does. So this model was called IVSN, for Invariant Visual Search Network. And the model does remarkably well in capturing basic human performance in searching for these isolated objects in an array of 6 objects. Great question. In this version, the attention map is fixed. So it's not updated. The only thing that's updated is that if the model gets it wrong, then that location is banned. So for example, in this case, the model selected this location, but it was wrong. That's not where the object is. First of all, how do we know that's where the object is or not? So in this case, we have an oracle. We know where the object is, so we should just say, you got it wrong, okay? I'll talk a little bit about what happens if we actually do recognition. That is, the model in principle should be able to recognize whether they got it right or wrong. When we're doing visual search, we don't have an oracle saying, yes, that's right or right. So here we have an oracle. If it's wrong, the only thing that we're changing is that we're zeroing out that location. So we're saying, that's not where it is. You cannot come back to this location, okay? So we have an oracle, we have infinite division of return, but we're not really updating the other parts of the map. and we're not updating any weights in the model at all. I'm going to relax some of those assumptions in a couple of slides and change some of these things. But here, there's nothing that's being changed. Right. So not only it's inefficient, but in some sense it's wrong. And I'm saying it's wrong because I told you that every time you move your eyes, you have part of the image at very high resolution and the rest with low resolution. Here we're assuming that we have the same resolution everywhere. We're going to change that in a couple of slides. Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Okay. The fact that the model does so well is largely coincidental. I'll show you now some other experiments where the model doesn't do so well. But at least at the qualitative level, the model can capture some basic aspect of human level performance. Again, because the target object and the search image are different, this is showing invariance, and I'll show you that they can also function in a zero-shot fashion. So first of all, I told you that the basic backbone of the model is something called VGG. This is a neural network, a deep convolutional neural network with 16 layers. If you change that architecture by that backbone by something else, nothing much changes. So here's the one that I just showed you. There's something called AlexNet, ResNet, FastRCN. These are different. This is jargon for different proxies for visual cortex, different deep convolutional neural networks that people have played with. And there's some difference between one and the other. In particular, this is a somewhat primitive version of visual models that does not work as well, but all the other ones work relatively well. So it doesn't, the details of what that architecture looks like don't seem to matter too much. Just a couple of comparisons with some other kinds of models that you may think would be useful. So the most basic idea for visual search, if you have never thought about it, would be to try to do template matching. You just take the object and you do template matching over the entire image. And that's not a very good model of human visual search. Again, remember that we are changing, we're rotating the object, we're changing the object. The object is can be a different exemplar. So template matching is not a good idea. That's not what humans do. There's a family of models that are called saliency models. They basically take an image and they detect what parts of the image are most interesting without information about the target. What does it mean to be interesting? Parts that have very high contrast, parts of the image where there is movement, changes in color, changes in illumination, etc., etc. That's also a pretty bad model. It's also pretty close to chance. So if you randomly move your eyes, if you have random weights instead of the pre-trained weights, if you use a sliding window, if you use bottom-up saliency, basically all of these null models don't work well in terms of visual search. So you do need this architecture. Which particular architecture to extract visual features doesn't matter too much, but you do need to extract visual features, and those features need to be related to the target to do efficient visual search. Okay. I'm going to perhaps accelerate a little bit now. So I just showed you a very simple task with isolated objects. What happens if you want to look for objects in real natural scenes? So now we're going to be doing the same thing. We have a target object, but now here we have a natural scene, and again, you have to do visual search. So it's the same idea. Subjects have to move their eyes until they actually find the target. So here, chance is more complicated. So if you are randomly moving your eyes, this is the performance that you would expect in this case. Again, this is the fixation number. This is cumulative performance. And then this is human level performance. Interestingly, at some point, human level becomes worse than chance. And that happens because again, sometimes humans repeatedly go back to previous locations. So in those cases where they have to make a lot of fixations, that is, it takes them a very long time to look for the target, humans end up sort of going back to previous locations, and our chance model doesn't do that. Our chance model, again, moves randomly, but never repeats a previous location. Okay, so that's humans, and that's our model. Again, here you see that our model does pretty well in solving this task. Our model does not match human performance as well as I showed you in the previous case. Again, we didn't really train the model to try to match human performance. The model is not trained with eye movements. There are no free parameters. We're not tweaking parameters. Just out of the box, the model does something that's qualitatively similar, but quantitatively not the same as humans. In particular, the model never goes below chance because this model, again, has infinite inhibition of return. It's not allowed to ever go back to previously visited locations. Okay, and then, okay, so just one quick comment. I told you that the way the model decides whether it found the target or not was by using an oracle. We tell the model, you got it right, you got it wrong. Instead of that, what we should be doing, and what we're doing here, is to have a visual recognition system. So at each location, we actually recognize the object and we say, is that similar to the target or not? So we compare the target with the location of the current saccade, and we threshold that and we say, did you find it or not? So this gives us worse performance now. We're still capturing the gist of human level performance, but this performs significantly worse, suggesting that the problem of recognition is not trivial, and it's hard to recognize the objects that the model was not trained on in this situation. And finally, just for fun, we did Waldo search with the computational model. And in addition to the fact that this was a torture to human participants, but fun for us to see, the other reason we wanted to do that is because we're absolutely sure that in the pre-trained system, that is in the models that were trained with ImageNet, there's nothing really like Waldo. Waldo is not an ImageNet. And so this is an example where we're really trying to push to do zero-shot visual search. None of the state-of-the-art object detection models would be able to solve the world's Waldo task, unless, of course, you train the heck out of those models with pictures of Waldo. Without training with Waldo, a model like YOLO, for example, one of the most famous models for object detection, is not able to find Waldo. So this is what happens in the worst Waldo task. Again, the red is human performance. The blue is our model. Again, without ever seeing Waldo before, just with a single exposure to Waldo, the model can qualitatively capture some aspects of human performance. It doesn't quite mimic, it's very far from being identical to human performance, but at least it captures some of the gist of what's happening during visual search. Okay, so the last point I want to make here is that I've been showing you the average cumulative performance. You can go into more detail, and I'm going to spare the details and not going into all the details here. But in addition to comparing the total number of fixations, you can actually look at the entire trajectory of how people move their eyes, right? So first you go to one location, another location, et cetera, et cetera. So now you have a sequence of eye movements, and you can compare the sequence of eye movements made by the model and made by humans. And that's a stricter test in a way than just comparing the total number of fixations. So what this slide is meant to show is a primary scan path. So let's say that that's a scan path from human visual search. It goes first to A, then C, then B, then D, then E. So that's the sequence A, C, B, D, E. That's how humans move their eyes in this particular case. And you could imagine different models. One that, in this case, the target was E. So one that found it and did A, C, D, E. Another one that did D, F, B, A, C, E, et cetera, et cetera. So we have different sequences, and we can compare those sequences. So we can use an algorithm similar to what people used in when comparing two DNA strings. So you probably know about DNA. You have these A, C, G, and T letters, and you have the strings of DNA, and you can compare two sequences. So we can use that to compare the spatiotemporal sequence of fixations, not just the average number of fixations. And I'm going to skip the details, but the short story is that the model can also capture in a qualitative fashion the actual spatiotemporal sequence of fixations, not just the average. Okay. All right. So that's what I wanted to say for the first part. And now I'm going to shift gears to talk about exploration and exploitation about this problem, about that people go back to previous locations, and talk about some other aspects of visual search, including how we train these models with the visual search diode. Any questions about what I've said so far? Okay, let me then move on and show you a pattern of eye movements one more time. So here we have an image. In this case, this is a subject that's looking for one particular kite within this image. So the subject made the first fixation here. Oh, yes. So we think that there's likely to be a top-down signal. So first of all, you need some memory of the object. We suspect that that memory happens in the prefrontal cortex. I showed you some suggestive evidence of that. If you inactivate prefrontal cortex, monkeys struggle with that. So that's why we call this prefrontal cortex. So we think that that's where the potential place for the memory of what you're looking for is. We think that there are top-down signals that modulate responses in this feature extractor network. Top-down meaning, in this case, from prefrontal cortex onto, let's say, IT, for example. From an area that stores information about what you're looking for onto an area that has information about visual features. So we tentatively call this prefrontal cortex. We tentatively call this ventral visual cortex, in particular, let's say, inferior temporal cortex. The product of these two things is an attentional map. We don't know exactly where this attentional map is in the brain. There's some evidence that it might be in another part called parietal cortex. I'm not sure. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to understand where that kind of, but we and basically every other model of visual search postulates that there is some kind of attentional map. This attentional map basically is a map of the visual field that basically dictates where you're going to move your eyes next. People have shown that there are many neurons in different parts of the brain that are predictive of where monkeys are going to move their eyes. So the idea that there is some kind of map that dictates where to move their eyes, I think is not completely crazy. So we think that the interaction between some kind of memory mechanism that we tentatively associate with prefrontal cortex with some kind of visual feature representation of the visual field that we tentatively associate with ventral visual cortex and perhaps higher levels of ventral visual cortex like V4 and IT, creates these attentional maps that then are basically dictating where the animal is going to move their eyes next. Once the animal moves their eyes, strictly speaking, you should be able to look at this location and then go back to the visual system and do object recognition. And I actually update those maps. And I'll show you a model where we actually do that. There's also yet another kind of memory that we are sort of imposing here, which is this inhibition of return. This inhibition of return basically says which locations of the images of the image have you already visited, and in this case we're prohibiting the models from visiting them again. And I'm about to relax that assumption by showing you that humans don't do that. Humans actually go back to the previous location. I would vote for the former. Again, by local, I don't mean a single neuron, but maybe there is an area, let's call it IT, let's call it parietal cortex. There's some evidence that it may be in parietal, but there is. I'm conjecturing here that there is some part of the brain that has something that looks more or less like this, meaning that there's a map of the visual field with some areas that have higher activation, and that those higher activations will dictate the location. And that happens in one particular area of the brain, maybe a couple of different areas, not just one, but not the entire brain. It's not distributed across tons of different regions. There is an actual physical location. That's a conjecture. There's a little bit of evidence towards that, not completely sealed. Any other comments or questions? Okay, so we're looking at this image. The subjects make a fixation here, then they move their eyes here, they move their eyes here, they move their eyes here, then here again. And then something interesting happens. Basically, they go back to a previously visited location. So we call these return fixations. So in some sense, you may think that this is a little bit perplexing. If you already visited that location, why go back to that location? If you have a system that has infinite inversion of return, by definition, you would not do that. And then the person actually goes back to location number 7, which is basically highly overlapping with location number 7, and then it makes another fixation to location number 8, which in this particular case is where that target was. But we were particularly intrigued by these return fixations, by the fact that subjects often go back to visiting locations that they have seen already. We were intrigued about this because we thought first that this was a little bit odd, that this was a little bit inefficient. And I think this opens the doors to investigate something that's been quite discussed in the neural network community, which is the trade-off between exploring new locations and exploiting existing locations. So you can imagine that you make a fixation and there's something very interesting in the image. You could just stay there with your eyes and capitalize on what you've seen there. And the cost of that is that you don't have time to explore many other locations. Alternatively, you could imagine that you will spend all your time exploring different locations, but then you may miss something interesting that happened in one particular location. So there has to be some trade-off between how much you explore, that means how much you go to new locations, versus how much you exploit, meaning how much you stay in one given location. And incidentally, we think that this actually highlights the fact that the visual recognition machinery is probably highly imperfect, meaning that within the course of eye movements, which typically last on the order of 200 milliseconds or so, it's quite likely that visual recognition fails very often. That is, when you're moving your eyes at these speeds, at approximately 200 or 100 milliseconds per location, there are many times where you actually don't really recognize what's in that location, further warranting going back to those locations. First of all, we thought that this was a peculiarity of visual search, and you're looking for Waldo, and you may suspect that as you're looking for Waldo, maybe your eyes landed on Waldo. You didn't realize that Waldo was there, and you kept searching. And you suspect that you do that. Indeed, yes, that's what you do. Many times you're moving your eyes were right on top of Waldo, and yet you stubbornly continued looking, and eventually you went back to that location. But we collected data from many of our friends and collaborators in a variety of different tasks, not just in visual search. And it turns out that this property of returning to previously visited locations is a rather ubiquitous aspect of how we explore images. It's not just restricted to visual search experiments. So these are different images in different species and different tasks. And all the yellow dots correspond to eye movements, or the red circles and red triangles correspond to locations in the image that are return fixations. These return fixations are quite consistent across different participants. So what you're seeing here are images that are seen in the left by a human. In this particular case, this is a free viewing, meaning that we're just showing this picture. There's no visual search task. People have to look at the image. And these are locations that humans had return fixations to. That is, that they made multiple fixations to that location. And the color indicates what fraction of the subjects had that particular location as a return fixation. So this is a highly stereotypical return fixation for humans when they're viewing this image. This image here is an image from one of our friends and collaborators, Carlos Ponce, looking at eye movements in monkeys, also showing that different monkeys, when they look at this image, they also make return fixations, and they also have stereotypical locations where they have return fixations too. Okay, so across a wide variety of different tasks, I will go very quickly here. This is the visual search task that I showed you earlier. This is the other visual search task I showed you with natural images. This is the Waldo experiment. These are humans looking at the same images, but without any task. We just show the image and we measure their eye movements. These are two experiments in monkeys from two different labs at Harvard doing free viewing experiments. Again, the monkeys are just fixating and moving their eyes freely on different parts of the image. And these are two somewhat fancy and complicated experiments where humans have some sort of a device that can allow them to actually navigate in the real world, and investigators were tracking their eye movements in a dynamic setting where not only are they moving their eyes, but they're also moving their head. And in one case, they're doing a visual search task. In the other case, they're cooking. And again, in both cases, we show that people made lots of return fixations. So here's the actual data. So what you'll see here is the proportion of return fixations. The dashed line here corresponds to how many return fixations you would expect by chance. So if you randomly throw eye positions in the image based on the size of the image and the criteria for defining return fixations, this is the number of return fixations you would expect. This is across a lot of different human participants, showing that about 10–15% of the time people make these return fixations. And the same is true about all the other conditions. So basically in all the other conditions, much less so in this case, but in all the other cases, both in monkeys and in humans, across visual search and no visual search tasks, with videos or with static images, people make lots of these types of return fixations. So humans and monkeys across different tasks are somehow combining the idea of exploring and making eye movements to different locations with the idea of exploiting and going back to previously visited locations. Just one more technical aspect of these return fixations. When they make a return fixation, we measure here the offset, that is the interval between the first time they visited one location and the next time they visited that location. So if the offset is 1, that means that they went from one location to another one, and then they immediately came back. If that offset is very large, that means that they visited many other locations before they came back. And what we looked at, what we're showing here is the distribution of those offsets. And what we're showing is that in the majority of cases, the offsets are very short, typically an offset of 1. Meaning that the most typical situation is where subjects are fixating one location, they go to another area, and then they immediately come back. So 2 would be that they look at one location, another one, and then they come back. The majority of cases, they look at only one other location and then they come back. And this is typical, again, across all the different experiments and different conditions. Okay, so we wanted to instruct our model to be able to have the same kind of trade-off of exploration and exploitation. So here are a couple of modifications to the model that I showed you before. First of all, we want the model to also be able to make eye movements during free viewing. That is when you don't have a particular target in mind. And so for that purpose, we have a purely saliency-based attention map. This is what I was referring to as a control before. So now, without any target, people are still moving their eyes based on parts of the image that are interesting. And this is purely based on bottom-up saliency, based on areas in the image that have very high contrast, differences in color, differences in illumination, and so on. So we create an attentional map that's purely based on saliency. Then we also create an attentional map that's based on the target image. And this is exactly the same thing that we were doing before. So we have a target image, we multiply that target image in a top-down fashion with the ventral visual cortex model, and we have a target similarity map, which is another attentional map. So we have a bottom-up saliency map, we have a similarity map. And now we're going to introduce two new maps to try to account for this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So this, we have the saliency map, we have the similarity map, and now we're going to introduce a memory map. The memory map basically remembers previously visited locations, but it doesn't remember them forever. So it tries to bias against looking at the same location so that the model doesn't get stuck in one particular location and doesn't move away. So it has a certain memory, but that memory decays over time. So the more time elapses, the more likely you are to go back to a previously visited location. And then the next aspect of the map that we are going to introduce here is a constraint on the saccade size. It turns out that there's a constraint in the musculature in the eyes, such that we don't make very, very large saccades. So for example, I cannot be fixating in one location and then move my eyes immediately and rapidly all the way to a place that's very, very far away. So the way you would do that, let's say you want to move your eyes, let's say 60 degrees of visual angle. That's a huge shift on the visual field. You don't do that in one saccade. You typically do that in multiple steps. So you go from here to here to here to here. So we have a constraint on how large the saccades are to mimic this idea that the muscles in the eye don't really make these enormous, very, very, very large movements. So we have four maps. Yes. Yeah, this actual, so I told you that everything we were doing so far, there are no free parameters, we're not fitting data at all. The exception to that is what we're doing here. So this is actual fitted on one of our experiments. So we looked at the experiment with the natural search images, and here we are actually fitting this map to the actual data. So this is actual data. So this is the distribution of the saccade sizes. So people typically don't make saccades that are very small, and people don't make saccades that are very large. So there is this kind of peak in saccades. So there's kind of a preferred saccade size. People don't make saccades that are super small, like 1 degree, and also saccades that are very large. So this map is actual. It's very small, so it's hard to see. But you're right. This is actual data, and it does have a peak. It's very consistent. I think, if I remember correctly, I think in the paper we actually showed those curves for individual participants, but it is quite consistent. There's a little bit of training. You can actually kind of train your eyes to move them further and to actually change the distribution a lot. In fact, people who play sports sometimes they can actually change this distribution slightly. If you're playing ping pong or baseball or tennis, where you actually have to sometimes make very rapid saccades, you can change this distribution slightly, but otherwise it's pretty consistent across subjects. Okay, so we have these four maps, and then we have a certain way of combining them by assigning weight. So now we have four free parameters that we're using to combine these four maps into a single attention map to be able to dictate where people will move their eyes. So we have a global attention map, which has a contribution of saliency, a contribution of similarity, a contribution of memory, and a contribution of the saccade size map. And again, here we're deviating from what I told you before. Before we were not fitting any parameters. Here we are fitting these four numbers, these four weights, based on the visual search experiment with natural images. So we have three things that we're fitting. We're fitting this distribution, we're fitting this distribution, and we're fitting these four weights here. And we're going to test it on the same data using cross-validation, but also on all the other experiments. So, for example, we're fitting these parameters on the natural images visual search task with humans, and we're going to test the exact same parameters in the monkey free viewing data or in the human free viewing data without any tweaking whatsoever in that case. And then what we do afterwards is basically the same. So we have this attentional map, and then we move our eyes. We have the recognition system. So the recognition says, is the object present in there, yes or no? And then we make a decision. If the object is there, we decide that we don't continue, so then we stop there. And then if the object is not there, then we have to continue. And then we have to now update all of these maps. So somebody asked before whether those maps were static. In the previous case, they were. Now we're updating those maps with every saccade. So every time the subject moves their eyes, there's an update in the memory map. There's an update in the saccade map, and then we're recomputing the attentional map. And this way we have a sequence of eye movements. Okay, and then very quickly, I just want to show you some of the results with this model. Again, on the left here, we have the pattern of eye movements that are made in this case by a monkey during free viewing. This is what the model does. Again, it's not quite identical, but it basically captures the gist of what's going on, and it makes return fixations, in this case in the same location. This figure also looks qualitatively similar to what I showed you before. The model again now is able to make return fixations, and again it finds a trade-off between exploring different locations and exploiting them. And the model also qualitatively, but not quantitatively, reproduces this offset, this fact that the model is sort of going very quickly to revisit previous locations with a very short offset. So to summarize, we have a basic computational model that's loosely inspired by aspects of neurophysiology as well as behavior, that can capture aspects of visual search in terms of efficiency, in terms of invariance, in terms of being zero shot, and in terms of displaying this trade-off between a lot of exploration and then being able to come back and exploit and recognize objects in the preferred locations. Any questions? I'm not sure. So the model here is shown in red. So this is the model. So here the model is again it shows return fixations, but it's somewhat above what it should be. For example, right? Yeah. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure. So this is what again we say the model is qualitatively capturing what's going on, meaning the model can reproduce return fixations. The model is not identical to humans, and in particular, there's heterogeneity between different participants. By the way, these are not all humans, so these are actually monkeys. But, so the model is not identical to the individual participants. The model in this case had some parameters that were trained with this data set here. I mentioned some of the parameters that were adjusted in this case. But all of these cases, the model was never trained with data from those tasks, and yet the model again can qualitatively capture partly what's going on. But yes, there sometimes the model is better than all the participants. In some cases, it's different. We're not claiming that the model is identical to the average human participant, nor that the model is identical to any one individual human participant. Any questions or comments? Okay. I want to show one more example of visual search, but maybe let's take a short break. Let's take 5 minutes, a 5-minute break. It's 4:18. Let's come back at 4:23, and I'll show the last change and addition to this family of models. Back at 4:23 then.
testing Heim's language vision to language matrix to also see if verbal descriptors can enable visual search.
Right. So yeah. So we actually tried a little bit of that. So in the first task, we had a picture, but we also showed the words. So I think the key issue is, in principle, you can use any features to model. So in principle, we can get features from language and try to create them, and then create some kind of feature that we can use for visual search. We tried a little bit of that, not very intensely, and it sort of worked, but not as well as the images. So I think part of the issue is when I ask, if I ask you, and I say this in words, right? So go and look for a computer. Okay, go and look for what's in when I say the word computer, right? So have some kind of representation, right? So probably we don't have such a perfect mapping between language and vision here. It's probably a worse mapping in a sense that if I show you a picture of the computer.
Like if I had never seen Waldo, and I would describe
That's even harder. So that we have not done. So that we have not done. So if you've never seen Waldo, I think it's difficult, right? So imagine it's hard to, Waldo, it's easy because you've seen it, right? Imagine now I have a new person, okay? Let's call it Susan, okay? Susan has a green hat, a purple sweater. She has 5 eyes, 3 noses. Okay, go and look for Susan. Okay, so I think it's doable, but it's harder, right?
Maybe it's easier for data sets and word descriptions, which are very different. I was just thinking, like exactly what I'm did in this project, because that is defined on image mechanisms or highlights. So maybe testing it with some of those descriptions could be interesting rather than things which are completely like fully shifted, like cartoon versus natural images are completely shifted.
Right, yeah. Again, we explored a little bit of that. I think there's probably more to be done in there, but yeah.
I was actually thinking that for a combination of visual search with language and reading, it would be so important for surveillance and crime, for example. If somebody sees somebody do something, like usually like if somebody makes a sketch in the in police departments and it's not always accurate and it's not scalable to detecting bad actors in society through camera. That have actually very nice applications.
Yeah, again, I think what Chaim did work because these are very single objects and mapping, and I'm skeptical that it can work for really IDing a face from a description. I think that in fact I'm not sure, but it's interesting. I mean, you can try any of DALI or any of the current diffusion models for image generations. My guess is that they would be pretty bad, right? So imagine somebody you know very well, your friend, your mom, your dad, and try to describe it in words. I doubt that you can get anything close to those images, right? And I don't think this is with Chaim's method or any method. I just don't think we are there. So how humans do it, I don't know. It's interesting, but
maybe when two people are sitting, one of the person has this image in their mind. I've never been to these sessions. Maybe it's interesting to see somebody actually draw image from descriptions one by one.
Yeah.
So one is a teacher network, the other is a learner network.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know if anybody has done this, but it's interesting. My guess is that current models would still be pretty bad.
In Andre's lab, like Lin her work was on student-teacher networks and about like how one network even tells the other network that it's doing wrong, because initially they have no language to begin with, and humans don't have a head start to that, especially for image viewing. And I'm imagining when two people are sitting and drawing they show the image. Does this look like the tree? And the image, no, it's nothing like that. Change the node a little bit, make it a little bit round or something like that. And then it goes again and goes again and goes again, and then finally the image will be consistent. It's kind of like an autoencoder decoder thing, but where the two networks are completely separate, and it's only like verbal descriptor that when
I agree. It's interesting to be done. Yeah. Okay, let's get started again. I'd like to give two more nuances and two more additions to these models of visual search. The first one has to do with explicitly incorporating the fact that we have high resolution in the fovea. And the second one has to do with understanding the role of the visual diet, of how the visual cortex of the model or the deep convolutional neural network of the model was trained, and actually show you that it can be relevant for some aspects of visual search. And along the way, show you the importance of the visual training diet in the performance of neural networks. To do that, I'm going to go to a classic example in psychophysics in visual search, which is visual search asymmetry. Let's see if it works. So first, I'm going to show you a search image. In this case, I'm going to ask you to search for this curved line. And I'll show you a picture that has this target object together with many destructors. And I will ask you, I'll try to do the way the psychologists do these demos, Jeremy Wolf in particular. I'm going to ask you to clap when you actually find this target image, okay? So are you ready? You have to find a curved line, and there will be many destructors. It will be pretty small. It will be the size of that of that image. In the actual experiment, they do it much larger. But anyway, so here's the object that you're looking for. Ready? As soon as you see this, just clap. Okay. All right. Okay. Good. So presumably you find it. Let's see, where is it? It's right here. Okay. Now we're going to do the same thing with another image. Let's see if I got this right. Okay, so there's the target. Okay, so now you have to find this image here. This is the target image. I'm going to show you a search image. Are you ready? I want you to clap when you see this image. Okay, so I measured it, and it took you a little bit longer in this case than in the other one. Okay, so no, not really. If you actually measure these things, it's a little bit harder to do the task on the right than the task on the left. That is, it's harder to search for a curve among lines than to search for a line among curves. This is called asymmetry in visual search. And then people have spent a lot of time quantifying this reaction time. So this is actual data now. What you're seeing here on the y-axis is the reaction time. That is how long it takes for people to clap. This is done in the lab. People are not clapping. In this particular case, people are pressing a space bar to say, I found it or I didn't find it. Okay? And then on the x-axis, you have the number of items on the image. That is how many things you have in here. So in this case, there are either 8, 16, or 32 items. Only one of them is the target, and all the other ones are destructors. So there are 7, 15, or 31 destructors. In the case of the example on the right, that is when you're looking for a line among curves, the time it takes to search for the object. We're not on Zoom? Oh. Maybe I got disconnected. Okay. So people disappeared, or you're, but you're the host, right? Okay. All right. Give me one quick second. No. Can anyone on Zoom other than Pranav give me some sign of life? Everybody's either sleeping or watching Netflix, or okay, somebody. Okay, some people on Zoom. Okay, good. All right. So Pranav, I think it's not me, it's you. All right. Well, okay. You're here, so if you're not on Zoom, you're fine. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So visual search asymmetry. This is not just the peculiarity of curves among lines. Psychophysicists have described lots of different examples where you have this asymmetry. So here's another one. You're looking for target objects that have different the different illumination directions, different lighting directions. So in this case, you're looking for an object that's illuminated from the left among destructors that are illuminated from the right. Whereas in this case, you're searching for objects that are that have illumination from the top with destructors that are illuminated from the bottom. And again, this one here, the vertical luminance case, is much easier than the horizontal luminance case. Here's another case. Again, you're always looking for this object in this image or this object in this image. In this case, we put red squares to show you where the target is. Of course, in the actual experiments, you don't have those red squares. Here's another example, looking for the letter L among letter T's or T's among L's. Looking for bars that have different orientations, etc., etc. So these are lots of different examples where there is a search asymmetry. That is, searching for A among B's is easier than searching for B's among A's. And here's the actual data. I just show you this example here. Here are many other visual search tasks, and they all show a pretty substantial difference in comparing one direction versus the other in terms of visual search. So again, we want to ask whether our very simple visual search models can capture this type of search asymmetry. And to do that, we first introduced an important ingredient that has to do with the eccentricity dependence on vision. So remember that I showed you that essentially you cannot read outside your fixation. You need to move your eyes in order to be able to read. And that's because you have very high resolution in the fovea, that is in the location where you're fixating, very poor resolution elsewhere. Again, you're basically legally blind in the periphery. If you look at what's happening outside of the fixation, you can actually see very little. And now going back very quickly to neurophysiology, what I'm showing you here is the size of the receptive field as a function of eccentricity. Some of you may remember that Rick Bourne gave a talk many weeks ago. He was describing how Hubel and Wiesel pioneered the idea of mapping the receptive fields and the structure of receptive fields in different parts of visual cortex. And each neuron has a particular part of the visual field that it's particularly sensitive to. And so for any given visual area, for example, for area V1, which is in the back of our brains, this is primary visual cortex, as you go from the fovea, that is the part where the animal is fixating, all the way to the periphery, that is different degrees of eccentricity, the size of the receptive field increases. That is, the receptive fields are pretty small in the part where you're fixating. They're much larger when you're moving farther away. So that's within one of these lines, within one of these colors, and that's within a visual area. In addition to that, we have multiple visual areas. You can imagine different layers in a deep convolutional neural network. So here you have data from V1, data from V2, data from V4. These are three different parts of ventral visual cortex, and this is the receptive field size in degrees of visual angle. So you see that from one stage of visual processing to the next, there's an increase in the receptive field size at a fixed eccentricity. So if you're moving vertically in this plot from one area to the next, the receptive field size increases. And horizontally or along each line within each area, there's also an increase in receptive field size with eccentricity. So we and also several other people implemented this very special way of sampling into the neural networks. So most of the neural networks that you're familiar with, that we've seen so far, have uniform resolution all over. So here we implemented an eccentricity dependent sampling. So this is the original image. We imagine that we're fixating in the center. So in different layers, we have different degrees of blurring, meaning that the receptive fields become larger as you go to the periphery. So this is what the image looks like with uniform resolution throughout the entire image. And if you have an image like this, you have very high resolution in the center, that is in the fovea, that's where you're fixating, and very poor resolution elsewhere. So basically, this is mimicking the idea that we're basically blind elsewhere. We have our system, our visual system sees something that's very blurry outside. This is why we cannot really read when we are very far away from the periphery. And we try to match these parameters roughly to mimic what we know from neurophysiology. So now this is the receptive field size of units in the computational model after incorporating this eccentricity dependent sampling. And you have different layers of the model. In particular, this is layer 10, 14, 18, different layers of the model. Within a layer, there's an increase in the receptive field size as a function of eccentricity. Across different layers, there's also an increase in the receptive field size. So this is basically taking the same architectures, but instead of having uniform sampling, having eccentricity dependent sampling. Okay, so now we are going to re-implement the same kind of models that I showed you earlier with this type of eccentricity dependent sampling. So we have a target image. This goes through the model. In each layer, there's this eccentricity dependent sampling. In particular, in this case, we start with uniform sampling, and we have this eccentricity dependent sampling only in the last 3 layers. We have a target image that goes through the model, and then we have a search image. Again, we have top-down modulation. In the model that I showed you earlier, we had top-down modulation only at one level of the visual hierarchy. Here we introduce top-down modulation at 3 different levels. So you can imagine that we have a multi-resolution way of incorporating information about the target at different levels of the visual hierarchy. The rest of the process is basically the same. So we're constructing an attentional map and using that attentional map to dictate the location of what's interesting in the image and the location of the next eye movement. So we have an overall attentional map. We have inhibition of return, and if the target is found, search stops. If the target is not found, we inhibit that location and go to the next location. And importantly, the difference here with respect to what I showed you before is that instead of having uniform sampling, we have eccentricity dependent sampling, which means that the map of those features changes every time you move your eyes. So every time the model moves their eyes, we need to recompute the entire set of features, and we recompute the attentional map. So we are updating this all the time. So this goes back to a question that was asked before. Everything I showed you so far, those attentional maps were, at the beginning they were fixed, then we updated them based on memory. Now we're going to be updating them also because of eccentricity dependent sampling, which is what happens in our brains. Every time we move our eyes, basically our brain is recomputing the entire image. Our receptive fields so one neuron that was responding to one location now basically sees a new location, and therefore the entire map of responses changes with every single eye movement. So again, the model weights were trained for object recognition in the ImageNet dataset. So we're not going to be training models to do specifically. There is no fine tuning to recognize the objects in the asymmetry search experiment. And this is important because we're going to be working with this kind of same type of very simple geometric shapes that people have been using in psychophysics experiments. So we're going to be looking for circles with different directions of illumination. We're looking for lines. We're looking for L's among T's. We're looking for curves. all of these models were trained on ImageNet. So they were trained on pictures of cats, dogs, chairs, etc., not on these particular psychophysics images. So this is the data that I showed you before for human performance. Now I'll show you what the model does in all of these different tasks. So this is the task that you did, where you were looking for curves among lines and lines among curves. So this is the asymmetry that I showed you earlier, and that you kind of reflected when you were clapping before. And the model, again, captures this asymmetry. So for the model, it's also easier to be able to search for curves among lines compared to lines among curves here. You can see that quantitatively, again, the model does not match human level performance. Again, we're not trying to fit parameters in the model and trying to make the model match these lines as much as possible. If one wanted to, one could do this very well. We can go back and train and adjust all these weights in order to get a very good quantitative map. But we're not trying to do that. We're taking the model off the box, and lo and behold, this model shows the kind of visual search asymmetries that are ingrained in the human visual system. And then again, very quickly, the same goes for most of the other tasks. So for some other tasks, it works better. So for some other tasks, it works worse. But largely, the model qualitatively captures these asymmetries in visual search. This is one exception for some reason that we don't fully understand. For this particular task, which is looking for oriented lines, the model was actually reversed. So the model got it completely wrong. So it has whatever the model thought was easier was actually harder for humans. For all the other tasks, the model off the shelf without any tuning matched the visual search asymmetry and also the direction of tuning. So just to quantify this, we defined an asymmetry index, and this is just basically the difference between the two conditions divided by the sum of the two conditions. So this is an index that goes between -1 and 1 that describes the slopes of this curve. So by measuring the slope of this curve, we can define how hard the task is. So if the slope is very shallow, that means that the task is very easy. That means you can add a lot of these structures and the reaction time doesn't change. If you have a very high slope, that means that the task is very hard. The more destructors you are, the more time it takes to find those objects. So the difference between these two slopes goes into this computation of the asymmetry index. Specifically, it's the difference divided by the sum of the two slopes, and that's shown here. So this is the human asymmetry index for the average across all the different tasks. This is the model that we proposed that has eccentricity dependent sampling. And again, it's not identical, but it basically captures this basic form of asymmetry. And then we tried a lot of different variations of the model just to illustrate how important different components of the models are. So we had different ablations of the model. So one is the model that I introduced earlier, the invariant visual search network model. This model does not have this eccentricity dependent sampling, and this model does worse in capturing the asymmetries in visual search. This is the asymmetry that you would expect by Chan's model. This is the asymmetry that you would expect by a purely bottom-up saliency model. That is a model that doesn't incorporate information about the target. This is what you would have with template matching. If you are doing template matching, this is a particularly bad idea in terms of visual search. This is a model that has target modulation only in one layer as opposed to 3 layers. So having target modulation across multiple different scales also helps. Removing the eccentricity dependence basically significantly impairs performance. And then the other point I wanted to make is that if this eccentricity dependent model is trained on digit recognition on the MNIST data set, which is the data set that you use for the first homework in the class, the model also performs significantly worse. So this was a strong hint that how the model was trained, that is what kind of features the model is used to, is actually relevant and important for performance in visual search. So the last point I want to make is how we can use this to begin to investigate aspects about the development of the model and the training regime that the model was subject to. Yes.
How does the visual asymmetry response look like when diversity in the extraction of mixes varies and is also qualitatively achieved by the model?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in all of these tasks, the distractors are homogeneous. And the reason for that is that this is how most of the visual search experiments in the history of psychophysics has been done in this case. If the distractors are also heterogeneous, that is, you have a lot of heterogeneity in the distractors, the task becomes significantly harder. And in particular, you again, depending on the degree of heterogeneity, you really see these almost flat lines here, where you can keep adding distractors and distractors, and performance doesn't change. So all the fact that this is pretty flat, meaning that you can keep adding distractors and people can find the object very quickly. This depends on having these distractors be uniform. The more different the distractors are, the more visual search actually looks like this. It's a bit harder to define asymmetry if the distractors are completely heterogeneous, right? So you can define asymmetry when you have curves among lines and all the lines are homogeneous. If all the lines are completely different, then it's a little bit harder to define what we mean by asymmetry. But it's a great question. So again, this is just one sample of all the possible visual search experiments. Okay, so the last point I want to make is what happens when we when we change the visual diet. And here we conjecture that how we are trained can impact the kind of visual search asymmetries that we experience. In particular, we took one hypothesis that has been around for quite some time in the visual search world, which is that, again, remember one of the examples I gave you is when you have illumination coming from the left, this here is actually harder to detect than, when you have illumination coming from the left, that is the horizontal illumination that is in red, that's harder to detect than when you have vertical illumination, that is when illumination basically comes from the top. So the conjecture has been in the psychophysics community that the reason for this asymmetry is that we have been trained for decades on cases where illumination comes from the top. Because illumination comes mostly from the sun, and even in a room like this, most of the time you have illumination coming from the top, not from the side. We're used to searching for things in images that are more like this than like this one here. That is very hard to test in humans. You'd have to take a baby and train them exclusively in an environment where illumination comes from a different location, etc., etc. But we can easily test that hypothesis in our computational models. So what we did here was take ImageNet and rotate all the images by 90 degrees. So the statistics of the ImageNet data set, which is the data set which has lots of objects that was used to train these neural networks, is basically governed by the kind of pictures that people post on social media and the kind of pictures that people post online. So for the majority of pixels, on average, the majority of pixels that are on ImageNet, the majority of pictures that are out there, illumination also comes from the top. So we can disrupt that by simply rotating all the images on ImageNet. And that's what we refer to as the 90-degree rotation ImageNet. And lo and behold, in the model, when we do that, that is, we have exactly the same model, except that the basic visual architecture was trained with 90-degree rotated images. We can reverse this asymmetry. So this is the asymmetry that we had before. So we still get asymmetry, but we get exactly the opposite effect. So now, when the model is actually used to seeing light coming from the side, basically the model finds it easier to search for objects that have illumination from the side than when you have illumination from the top. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because the models can help us investigate some aspects of visual development that can maybe be very hard to examine at the neuroscientific level because of the complexity of doing some of these experiments, but we can test some of these hypotheses here. And this also suggests that in the context of developing neural networks, astutely choosing our training set can really have a pretty significant impact on the kind of results that we get. I won't have time to go into discussing context because we are running out of time, but I want to end with showing you a couple of cases where the model fails quite miserably. So I showed you that we have a skeleton of a model that's largely inspired by some basic ideas in neuroscience. We have constraints on the eccentricity-dependent sampling. We have constraints on exploration and exploitation. We have constraints on the base texture of the system. So inspired by these ideas, we have a model that can capture, at least qualitatively, some aspects of visual search. We can do visual search in a way that's invariant, zero shot, and so on. So I want to end up by giving you a couple of failure cases and tell you some of the key ingredients that are missing in these kind of models, and one of the things that I think where I should go next. And in particular, here are examples of 3 of the main visual search tasks that I mentioned: the Waldo search, the natural image search, the object array search. And then on the left, we have performance of the model. On the right, we have human performance. We have some cases where the model is better than humans, other cases where humans are better, and many other cases where humans and the model are comparable. And I want to end by showing you one example, which is a pretty serious failure for the computational model. So this is a case where the model and humans are trying to find this toy windmill in this image. Again, it's very hard for you to see this. Again, in the actual experiments, these objects are much larger. The actual target object is located somewhere in here. So this is the pattern of fixation that a typical human made when searching for this object. So they looked here first, 1, 2, I don't know where 3 is, then 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. In about 10 fixations, the model found the humans found the target in this case. In stark contrast, our model was all over the map. It took 23 fixations to find the target, so more than twice as much. And you can see just by eyeballing the pattern fixations that this is a mess, that the model is not quite reproducing what humans are doing here. So what's going on here? I spent a lot of time trying to convince you that the model captures, at least at a qualitative level, some aspects of visual search. And I'd like to end by highlighting some of the key challenges ahead. And I think that one of the things that's happening here is that humans use a lot of contextual information that the model knows absolutely nothing about. So I told you about a couple of different types of maps that we can use. So we have a saliency map, that is what parts of the image are interesting, meaning what is salient, where there are major changes in illumination, color, and so on. I told you about a similarity map, that is comparing the target with different features of the object. And I told you about some aspect of memory to avoid having too many return fixations. But I would contend that humans are not only doing that, but they also have some sort of understanding that on average, it's unlikely, for example, that toy windmills will be hanging from the ceiling. It could be, but on average, they are not. In most images, they're not. So at a very quick glance, humans may look at this and decide very quickly that that's not an interesting part of the image to explore. And if you do that, you would basically already get rid of a lot of these fixations. These are locations that, according to the model, they have relatively high similarity to the toy windmill, or at least sufficiently high similarity that it's worth exploring further with an eye movement. Similarly, humans quickly realize that the toy windmill is probably not on the floor, and therefore, they focus mostly on looking on top of the table, on top of this shelf here. Humans understand the concept of support, the fact that the toy windmill is probably not flying in the middle of the air, it's probably not hanging from the ceiling, it's probably not on the floor. So there's a lot of contextual reasoning that humans are probably using in here. And in fact, if you just eliminate the ceiling and the bottom part, the model already looks much more similar to humans. So even just basic aspects of contextual reasoning may potentially go a long way in improving performance in the model. So I won't have time. We and many other people are very interested in the notion of how do we understand scenes, how do you incorporate contextual reasoning. That's a topic for another day. And I'd like to just summarize with, again, iterating some of the basic themes here. So we have an initial computational model of visual search that can account for efficiency in different kinds of images, in object arrays, in natural images, even in things like finding Waldo, even though the model never saw Waldo before. So this model can do visual search in a zero-shot fashion by having a single exposure to the target image. They can do so in a way that's invariant to the exact shape of the object that can change between the target and the search image. The models can account for the trade-off between exploration and exploitation and perform return fixations. And they can even account for classic aspects of psychophysics like visual search asymmetries. There's another phenomenon called feature conjunction that I didn't have time to discuss. More generally, I'd like to insist that we can use basic aspects of behavior and neurophysiology as a constraint to build models. And also the fact that we can build parameters, but we can build models that are parameter free, where we're not doing tweaking of parameters and lots of data fitting with millions and millions of examples. We don't need to collect human eye movement data in order to fit the models. We take the models with basic conjectures, and at least again at a qualitative level, the model can capture essential aspects of visual search. The models can achieve efficiency, zero-shot search, without having to fine-tune and tweak the models. So that's it. I'll stop there. Thank you. Any questions? Mishu. Not really. So if you look at psychophysics, there's some sort of hand-wavy explanation of why. I'm not very convinced, but some people have some kind of explanation. In the case of the illumination, the hand-wavy explanation is we're used to having light come from the top, and that's why it's easier to search for those. That's why there's an asymmetry between those two. So that's the one that we tested by rotating images. In the other cases, there's a kind of word models, or what I call word models. So for example, people say that it's easier to search for the absence of a feature than the presence of a feature. That's the way they explain the difference between curves among lines and lines among curves. It's hard to test that hypothesis. Let me also tell you one thing that we have done without much success yet, which is, given the computational model, we said, can we create new images that will have asymmetry? You can imagine that you now take different kinds of objects, and I ask you, is it easier to search for chairs among tables or tables among chairs? Is it easier to search for the letter B among letter C or C among B? Is it easier to search for men among women or women among men? Can go on and on. Any kind. In principle, in the computational model, we can test any kind of asymmetry. And we've had minimal success, to be honest, in actually predicting human-level asymmetry based on computation. So it's suggesting that our models are not quite there yet. So yes, we can capture some of the basic psychophysics experiments in visual search asymmetry. But it's been very, very hard for us to come up with new predictions and design new experiments. And actually, given two arbitrary object classes, can we predict what direction the asymmetry, when there will be asymmetry, and in which direction that will be? We're above chance, but we're not very good at doing that, suggesting that we still have a long way to go in terms of our models. And that's important to note, because that's different from what I was showing at the end. So that's not contextual reasoning. Even with isolated objects, we're still not quite there at describing all of these kinds of visual search asymmetries. Any other questions? Okay, if there are no further questions, then thank you very much. Next week we have, we're going to switch gears and talk about language with Andrei Barbu from MIT talking about language. All right, thank you.